Welcome. My name is Josh Camp. I'm a public diplomacy officer at the U.S. Embassy in Dhaka, Bangladesh. I want to welcome you all here today for an exciting program about inclusion and elections. Tonight's program, Ensuring Equal Access for Persons with Disabilities in Elections and Political Processes, is part of a series of programs hosted by the U.S. Embassy in celebration and recognition of the 58th U.S. presidential election. In November, the United States will hold elections across our country, electing representatives from the president all the way down to local, municipal, and sub-municipal level offices. This briefing and program today is being recorded and may be posted on the U.S. Embassy's social media. In terms of ground rules, there are just a few things to keep in mind while participating in tonight's program. First, we have muted all participants. This ensures the highest quality experience for all our participants. We request that guests modify your name on the participant list. You can hover your mouse over the participant list and click to change your name. If you would like to follow our pattern, we frequently list organization and first name. For our guests, for your convenience, we've included a sign language interpreter. We're so happy to have him with us. Tonight's primary speaker, Virginia Atkinson, from the International Federation for Electoral Systems, is an inclusion and elections expert. We're happy to have her with us. Her views represent her own views and opinions and do not necessarily represent the views of the US government. After her presentation, we'll have a small talk by Nazmus Sakib, a student and election volunteer, civil society actor, a student at Dhaka University. Following which, we will take your questions. You may submit questions at any time tonight in the chat box. Please submit your questions. We'll consolidate questions and then ask them to our panelists at the end of the program. Throughout the course of the evening, please post your questions. We'll do our best to address as many as possible. Before we get started, it's my great pleasure to introduce the Public Affairs Officer here at the U.S. Embassy in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Arlisa Reynolds is a Foreign Service Officer with nearly 20 years experience representing the United States in South America, in Europe, Russia, South Asia, China. Most recently joining us from an academic program in the United States. We are so happy to have Arlisa Reynolds with us for opening remarks. Arlisa?
Assalamu alaikum, Shubho Shonda. Apnadir Maje Ashtepare Ami Anodito. That's the limit of my Bangla, and I'm sorry if I slaughtered it. But it's so good to have you join us this evening. Welcome to the American Center for this discussion about disability inclusion in the electoral processes. As Josh said, this couldn't be a more timely discussion in the United States. As he mentioned, we are going through our general elections and a presidential election. In addition, this year is the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I assume, Virginia, you can just nod your head. I assume Virginia will be speaking a lot about that. So this is a really exciting time, 30 years of basically landmark legislation, civil rights legislation. Also, just this month, we have celebrated 3 major anniversaries related to elections and voting. Earlier this month was the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which made it stops states from preventing people from voting due to race. So this was a big deal. Just in the past 2 weeks, we've celebrated the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, which secured in our Constitution voting rights for women in America. And then last week was Women's Equality Day. And this whole month in the United States has been the National Month of Women's Suffrage. So it's just been, the last 2 months have been huge for when we think about expanding voting rights for American citizens. But it wasn't easy, it took a long time, and maybe Virginia, I don't know, Virginia is going to talk a little bit about the history, so I won't go into that. But before we go into our program, I did want to mention about the challenging times we find ourselves in. I think all of us know COVID-19 has really upended our normal life. We are doing things in different ways. And also in Bangladesh, there's been recent flooding that's caused additional hardship. And on behalf of the US Embassy in Dhaka, I want you to know that our hearts go out to all of you that have been affected. We remember and honor those who have been lost, and we wish well those who are ill, and we send our best wishes to the families that have been affected, and also to the families, the people that have been impacted by the floods and Cyclone Amphan. We offer our deepest sympathies. We continue to support the government of Bangladesh as it provides its COVID-19 support and also humanitarian assistance to those affected by the flooding. As I mentioned earlier, tonight's topic could not be more timely, and thrilled to have Virginia here. I cannot wait to have her talk about disability inclusion in the political space. I can't see everyone's names out there, but I believe we have a member of Parliament. I'm looking at some of the other lists of people as you pop up, and it looks like we have lots of civil society advocates, political activists, disability rights activists, and others joining us. And one of the reasons I got into my job is I started actually at a governor's office in my home state. And I got involved because I wanted to see if I could make a difference in my community, in my home state. And I think that all of us, we can all play a role, wherever we are, we can play a role, whether it's advancing disability rights, whether it's advancing women's rights, the rights of indigenous people, whether we're fighting for cleaner air. There are so many things that we can do in our own space and where we are, and we can also join together. Because I can see Virginia is going to talk about the history, and I'm just going to skip through some of my remarks also. We got it started a little late. I just wanted to add a couple things that in the United States, we did have laws protecting the rights of people with disabilities, but prior to the Americans with Disability Act, it had been treated more as a health issue rather than a civil rights issue. And so I'm sure Virginia will go into this, but as soon as our Constitution was adopted in 1788, I believe, the next year we started adopting the Bill of Rights, and part of the Bill of Rights were civil liberty protection. So everything from free speech, dissent, peaceful protest. Eventually, additional amendments included the elimination of slavery. I mentioned the right of women to vote, the recognition of the right of African Americans and others not to be discriminated from voting. And today we see all those civil rights as basic fundamental freedoms. And the wonderful thing about the ADA is that it allows people with disabilities to be able to, the purpose of it is to ensure that they can fully participate in all aspects of society, including voting. And again, I think Virginia will talk about that. I just wanted to mention, I've learned that Bangladesh is a party to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And also, you also have a 2013 Persons with Disability Rights and Protection Act. And all of these steps help you in Bangladesh, just as in the US, our ADA and the subsequent legislations help our countries become more democratic and equal and just for all. We look forward to continuing to work and partner with those of you out there who are interested in working on these issues. If you haven't been to visit us right now, we're closed because of COVID, but our building here, I'm actually here at the American Center. We have our facilities are full access. So if you want to visit us, we would love to have you once we're open. And I would just close by saying I really look forward to hearing from Virginia. And I don't know the name of the youth, but I look forward to hearing from a Bangladeshi youth about his experience. And I'll just close with a quote from our Secretary of State, Michael Pompeo. He said, "The US government remains firmly committed to upholding the universal rights and fundamental freedoms of the more than 1 billion people living with disabilities worldwide. We want all people, including people with disabilities, to have the knowledge, skills, and opportunity to pursue their aspirations, develop their capabilities, compete and succeed in the 21st century." And we want them to be able to have a voice in society. So I hope everyone enjoys tonight's discussion. Thank you. Onik onik donobad.
Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Virginia Atkinson, the Senior Global Inclusion Advisor at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. She's provided strategic leadership to IFES's disability rights portfolios and technical assistance and training to civil society organizations across the world. She specifically works on initiatives to advance human rights among women, youth, and disabled persons. We're so excited to have her joining us virtually, and perhaps someday in the future, who knows, maybe in Dhaka. Virginia, over to you.
Thank you, Josh. Good evening, everyone. I'm really happy to be with you all here today. My name's Virginia. I have long, light brown hair, much longer than usual. I haven't had a haircut since the virus started, and I'm wearing a blue shirt with a long gold necklace. I do have a PowerPoint today, and there's a lot of photos in it. So whenever I come across a photo, I will describe it to make sure that everyone is getting all of the information that we're talking about today. So I'm going to speak a little bit about participation in political life for people with disabilities, both here in the US, as well as in countries around the world. So my job at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFES, usually used to involve a lot of travel. I would go to countries all around the world, including in Southeast Asia, and work with people with disabilities and with governments to help them make sure that people with disabilities are included in political life. And very often that included providing guidance, for example, on how you can implement and enforce the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which as Arlisa mentioned, Bangladesh has ratified, but unfortunately the US has not yet. We've signed it, but we haven't ratified. So this initial photo I have here is 2 women and 2 men who are using wheelchairs from Indonesia, and they're holding up their pinky fingers showing the purple ink from voting. Let's see. It's not letting me change to the next slide. Nope, there it goes. Okay. Never seamless with technology, is it? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Americans with Disabilities Act and how that then became the basis for the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and give some examples of how the ADA came to be here in the US, and then talk a little bit about good practice examples from other countries all around the world of ways that people are, like advocates and governments, are making sure that people with disabilities are included in political life. There's a photo on this slide, and it shows a woman in the Philippines with Down syndrome putting her ballot in the folder to be counted. So we're going to start first actually with a quiz. Don't worry, some of them are more difficult than others, but we will walk through each one and discuss it. So the first quiz question we have, and you should see a Zoom quiz feature pop up. Here we go. How many people in the world have a disability? So the first option is 1 billion. Second option is 2 billion. The third option is 3 billion. So we have some votes.
1 million, 1 billion.
Looks like 1 billion is winning, but quite a few people have selected 2 billion, and 3 billion is in third place. More votes coming in. So we have a clear winner. It looks like we have 60% of people are saying 1 billion people have a disability in the world. That's correct. So the World Health Organization has that estimate, and 1 billion people is 15% of the world's population. So when you think about, like in the US or in Bangladesh, if 15% of the population are left out of participation in political life, that's a lot of people that are not being included. So we have our next question. Question number 2. Of people with disabilities who live in low and middle income countries, what percentage are women? So number 1, 25%. Number 2, 50%. Number 3, 75%. So it doesn't seem to be a clear winner yet. We might have equal amounts of votes for each answer, 25%, 50%, 75%. So 50% is eking just barely ahead, but there's not quite a consensus. Okay, it looks like 50% is what the majority of people have guessed. The number is actually 75%. So if we're talking about gender and disability, think about the unique barriers that women with disabilities might encounter. So women with disabilities would encounter all the barriers that women without disabilities would encounter, as well as the barriers that people with disabilities would encounter. So when we're working to make sure that the political process is inclusive of all people with disabilities, we also need to think about things from a gendered perspective and think, you know, what are the unique barriers that women in particular might experience if we want to make sure that the process is fully inclusive. So the next question. How many of you have heard of the Americans with Disabilities Act? This is an easy one. Yes or no? It looks like most people have heard of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Yay, yes, thumbs up. So as you heard in the opening remarks, this year, July 2020, was the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So here in the US, there's been a lot of celebration and also, quite frankly, a lot of reflection on, we've had this landmark disability rights legislation for 30 years now, and we have made a lot of progress, but there's still a lot more that needs to be done. So I look forward to talking a little bit more about that going forwards. And we have 2 more questions. So the 4th question should be popping up now. What percentage of polling stations are physically accessible in the US? So number 1 is 20%, number 2 is 40%, number 3 is 60%. What percentage of polling stations are physically accessible? So we're talking about fully physically accessible. Looks like we might have a tie between 40% and 60% as the top vote getters, and just a few people voted for 20%. So surprisingly to me, at least 40% is the answer here. You would think after having the Americans with Disabilities Act for 30 years that maybe this would be closer to 100. But we have something called the Government Accountability Office here in the US. And in 2017, the Government Accountability Office did an audit of polling stations across the US, most of which are in schools, and found actually only 40% are entirely physically accessible. And so when I say entirely, I mean the parking lot, the entrance to the building, once you're inside the building, as well as the restroom. So only 40% of polling stations in the US are accessible in all of those different areas. So you see we have a lot of work to still do to make all of our polling stations completely accessible. And the side effect of that is, since most polling stations are in schools, this means we also still have a lot of work we need to do on making schools accessible so that teachers and students with disabilities can also have equal access to the education process. So we have one more question. All states in America allow people with intellectual disabilities to vote. Do you think that's true or false? It's like false is winning, but it's going back and forth a little bit here. Okay, so it's very close. We have 48% voted true and 52% voted false. So actually the answer is false. In the US, we have this very strange system, which is not like most countries. We don't have a national election law that applies to everybody. So most countries around the world have the same rules for the entire country of who's allowed to vote. In the US, it's based on each individual state. So every state gets to decide the regulations for voting, the process for voting, who's allowed to vote. And in 38 out of 50 states here in the US, if you're under guardianship, which many people with intellectual disabilities are, then you're not allowed to vote. And guardianship means that maybe you have trouble managing your finances, and so you need someone to help you with that, for example. And so the court would appoint a guardian to you, and that person would help you manage, for example, your finances. But unfortunately, what happens is that you're not allowed to vote when you're put under guardianship in many states. I see Josh is raising your hand. Yes?
Virginia, beyond guardianship, could you describe or define for us disability? What does disability mean in the United States or in the international context?
So I will be talking about that going forward. One of the unique things about the Americans with Disabilities Act is that it doesn't define specific disability types. It doesn't say, if you have this list of different types of disabilities. It defines disability more from the perspective of functioning. So if you have difficulty, for example, walking or seeing or hearing or breathing, and this leaves, this broader interpretation means that more people are included, which has the positive side effect of it also including people, giving people legal protections that maybe wouldn't self-identify as having a disability, but from a functional perspective, you do. So for example, many older people maybe have difficulty seeing, but they wouldn't say they have a disability. They would just say, I'm older and my vision isn't as good as it used to be. Or maybe I'm older, so I have difficulty climbing stairs. But from a functional perspective, older people do have a disability and would need reasonable accommodations. And the unique thing about that definition, that sort of broad definition of disability, is that it's carried over into the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which also doesn't specifically define disability types. It's also based more on functioning. And this is really positive because when we talk about just specific disability types and then those are put into law, it excludes people with new types of disabilities and new diagnoses that might come up 10, 15 years after a law is passed, but then wouldn't be included if the law has these specific disability types listed. Does that answer the question? Okay. So that's the end of our polling. See if I can close this here. Go to the next slide. It is not cooperating. Go to the next slide here. There we go. Okay. So why was the ADA needed, the Americans with Disabilities Act? Why was it needed? One of the main reasons is that the ADA wasn't the very first disability rights legislation here in the US. There was previously something, well, there still is something called the Rehabilitation Act. And that was in the early 1970s, but it wasn't being implemented or enforced. So people with disabilities had this legislation that protected their rights, but the government wasn't doing anything with it. It was just a piece of paper. So in what became a series of really creative and high profile protests that were all very peaceful, but very coordinated, the disability rights community did a number of things across the US, in particular focusing on Washington, DC. One of them, which the photo here on the left-hand side shows, is people with physical disabilities crawled up the steps of the Washington Capitol. So in the 1970s, the capital of the US, so the seat of our government and where our Congress meets, was not physically accessible. And people that used a wheelchair or people that used crutches couldn't get in. There wasn't any way to get into the Capitol that didn't involve steps. So in order to demonstrate this and to demonstrate that people with physical disabilities were not able to enter the seat of the government, of Congress, they staged this protest where they crawled up the steps. And it got so much media attention and brought a lot of pressure to Congress to prioritize disability rights. People also did things like wheelchair users went to the homes of senior government officials and they barricaded themselves outside the bottom of people's driveways. So the government officials couldn't get out of their homes because there was a series of a wheelchair blockade at the bottom of their home, at the bottom of their driveway. There was also the longest government sit-in of any government building. So a peaceful protest where people with disabilities occupied a government building in San Francisco for 25 days. And that was in the 70s, and it still remains the longest that any US government building has been occupied by protesters by far. So people with disabilities still hold that, that record. And this was despite the government doing everything they could to make them uncomfortable. So they would turn on the fire alarm in the middle of the night, or they would turn on the sprinklers. They made it as difficult as possible for it to be comfortable, but people with disabilities still stayed and were still very peaceful. And what was quite unique about this protest is that other identity-based groups came to their aid. So for example, African Americans here in the US at the same time were having similar struggles and pushes for their rights. And so they joined forces, and members of the African American community, for example, brought food to people with disabilities that were protesting and holed up inside of this government building. The women's movement also was very supportive and was a good ally to people with disabilities during this protest. So all of these peaceful protests and all of this coordinated action actually led eventually to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more about that, there's 2 movies that are specifically about this time in US history. One is called Lives Worth Living, and that, for the US Embassy folks, that aired on PBS. And I think at least previously, Judy Heumann, who was the International Disability Rights Advisor at the State Department, she had several copies that she could loan out to embassies if they're interested. And then just this year, there was a new movie that came out called Crip Camp, and that is on Netflix. And that tells the story of, there was a group of young people with disabilities who used to go to this summer camp in the 1970s all together. And the camp was for young people with disabilities specifically. And they all became friends. They would come every summer to this camp for young people with disabilities. And many of them then went on to be the advocates and the leaders of this peaceful protest movement, which led to the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the other thing I wanted to highlight here, which we did now discuss, I guess, briefly, was that because the Americans with Disabilities Act ended up being used as the basis for the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, one of the main things that carried over was this intentionally broad definition of disability. And so that was a hallmark of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then it's also part of the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So what does the ADA say? First of all, it requires all new buildings or renovations to be accessible. So if you have a really old historic building and you are making some updates to it, for example, just to change the appearance and freshen up the appearance, that means you're making a renovation to the old building. So you need to also then make sure that you make everything accessible in the building. So this means that we've gone a long way in the last 30 years in physical accessibility, but there are still, as the Government Accountability Office report showed, there's still a long way to go, in particular for polling stations, to make all of them physically accessible. So the Americans with Disabilities Act also requires that communication aids and services be provided to people with disabilities. So for example, that means that sign language interpreters should be included in government communications. And something that's really interesting that's happening right now is the Americans with Disabilities Act says all government communication needs to be accessible. And I'm sure you've noticed, and I'm sure the same thing is happening in Bangladesh, where the government has been having a lot of briefings lately about coronavirus. And so because those are official government briefings, they should be accessible and inclusive per the US law, but there haven't been sign language interpreters on the coronavirus briefings. So there's actually a National Association of the Deaf here in the US that is suing the federal government because those coronavirus briefings do not include a sign language interpreter. And that's one of the very unique aspects of the Americans with Disability Rights Act, is that it has really strong implementation and enforcement mechanisms, which also include allowing individual citizens to sue the government. And in the case of voting, the Department of Justice, so the federal government, will actually go out to the state level governments and monitor compliance of accessibility at polling stations. So the image here on the left is from an architectural standards guide that the government produces on how to make polling stations accessible. And it's a cartoon, and it shows a man who's blind using a walking stick, but they have placed the voting sign somewhere that's inaccessible. So he is, walking into the sign. So this graphic is in a set of architectural standards that the federal government provides to state governments on how to ensure that polling stations are accessible. And this particular picture is an example of what not to do. And this is something that's quite unique about the Americans with Disabilities Act as well, is that the government actually provides a lot of guidance to states on how to implement and enforce it. So it provides tips on how to take what the law says and make it practical. And then one of the last things that's unique and has been sort of exported from the Americans with Disabilities Act is this concept of reasonable accommodation. So when we say reasonable accommodation, that means things that will help, for example, a person with a disability do their job. So maybe you get a job in an office, but you need a screen reading software, for example, in order to help you do your job. That screen reading software would be what the Americans with Disabilities Act calls a reasonable accommodation. Or maybe you, to do your job, you need a sign language interpreter. That's another example of a reasonable accommodation. And the reason it's called reasonable is because the concept of what is appropriate depends on each organization. So for example, a really small organization wouldn't be considered reasonable for an expense that's bigger than, say, the budget of the organization. That wouldn't be considered reasonable. But the same reasonable accommodation at a very large organization would be possible. So there's this sort of sliding scale of the types of accommodations that can be provided in the workplace. So there's quite a few barriers that people with disabilities experience to participation in political life. We've discussed the first one a little bit, discriminatory legal frameworks. So like I said, in the US, in 38 out of 50 states, the law says if you're under guardianship, you're not allowed to vote. And I do think actually that in Bangladesh, your constitution says that you can vote unless you stand declared by a competent court to be of unsound mind. And so sometimes that wording unsound mind is targeted specifically to people with intellectual or psychosocial disabilities. So it might be possible to be used in that way. There's also physical barriers. I think this is perhaps the most obvious when we think of barriers to the political process. We think of the actual physical barrier, maybe stairs into the polling station. Stigma, disinformation, and hate speech are becoming bigger and bigger issues. Disinformation and hate speech in particular with the rise of social media. Inaccessible information is a barrier. The image on the right-hand side of this slide is a screenshot from a video in sign language, in Tunisian sign language. And it shows a man and a woman speaking in Tunisian sign language about the coronavirus and what the risks are. And this is important because a lot of information around the virus is not disseminated in accessible information. So people with auditory or with visual disabilities are not getting all of the relevant updates that we all need about the virus. Another barrier to political participation is if there's insecurity or if there's conflict. And then lastly, and most recently, COVID-19. So some people with disabilities are immunocompromised, which means that maybe they're going to be even less willing or likely to want to go out to vote on election day if they're concerned about the virus. And the other thing that we're learning is that older people are more likely to have adverse reactions to the virus. And in some countries, like here in the US, most of our poll workers are people that are, let's say, 60 years old or older. And so what's happening in the US right now is we have an election in November, and most of our poll workers are usually over 60 years old, but people over 60 years old are at more risk, of adverse effects from the virus. So we're having a harder time recruiting poll workers for our election, since our normal base is made up of people that are most at risk of the virus. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some examples from other countries all around the world of how creative solutions to sort of mitigating some of these barriers. So the first aspect of the electoral process, and once, of course, the law allows you to vote, is voter registration. And so if the voter registration process is inaccessible, then it doesn't really matter what else is done throughout the rest of the electoral process, because you won't have registered to vote in the first place. So the image on the left-hand side is from Nepal, and it shows two women who are actually reading voter registration information that's been provided in Braille. The image on the right-hand side is from a shopping mall in the Philippines, where there is a Burger King in the background of this photo. It's taken in the food court. And in the Philippines, in 2011, the Election Commission piloted letting people with disabilities specifically register to vote in shopping malls. So most government buildings where normally you would need to go register to vote were not accessible, but most shopping malls are accessible. And think about how convenient that is. You're already probably going to be you're more likely to be at the mall than you are to be at some random government building in order to register to vote. So this was something the government piloted for people with disabilities specifically, and then it was so popular, they've now expanded it, and people with disabilities can also now vote in the shopping mall. So this is somewhere you might be already anyway. It's accessible, it's convenient. You don't have to go with a family member to some random place you would not usually be going that's probably not accessible. So I thought this is a great idea. I feel like we should all be doing this. It would be so much more convenient if we could all vote places that we might be going anyways. The next thing to think about is voter education information. And the image on the right-hand side is from Moldova. It's a cartoon, and it shows a man and a woman putting their ballot into the ballot box. And this guide is an easy to read guide. So easy to read is a type of information that is in simple text, in large font, and it's designed to make reading materials easier to understand for people with intellectual disabilities in particular. But we've found when we put voter education information in this simple, easy to read format, that actually everybody really benefits from it. And in particular, also people with low literacy benefit from this method. On the left-hand side, this is an image from a cartoon strip from Myanmar, and it shows a cartoon of a woman who is using a wheelchair talking to another woman. And this was one image of a set of about 10 cartoon strips in a brochure that was targeting women broadly, that we just integrated images of women with disabilities into the cartoon. So in Myanmar, we found that women were a lot less likely than men to know how to mark their ballot correctly. So in that country, if you don't do a tick mark to mark your ballot, it doesn't count. You can't mark your ballot with an X or a circle or a line. It has to be a check mark. And women were a lot less likely than men to know that, which meant that their votes were not going to count if we didn't do a big voter education information campaign. So while doing this information campaign targeting women, we also made sure to integrate images of women with disabilities into that cartoon strip. Polling station access, I think, is the thing we all think about first when we talk about access to elections. The image on the left-hand side is from Armenia, and it shows a man who uses a wheelchair being pushed up a very steep ramp by someone else. So while it's good that the government has installed this ramp into the polling station, it's just way too steep to actually be usable. So this is where we come back to the Americans with Disabilities Act and the importance of having architectural standards and a universally agreed definition of what accessible means. So in this case, probably they thought, oh, we've put a ramp in, job done, this building is accessible. But as you can see from how steep this ramp is, this is not an accessible building. There's no way that someone who uses a wheelchair could get up the ramp by themselves or get down without hurting themselves because it's so steep. The image on the right-hand side is from Georgia, the country Georgia, and it shows a voting booth that is fitted for a wheelchair user. So in many countries, the voting booths are for standing height. And if you use a wheelchair, you often have to vote in your lap, out in the open, so everybody else can see how you're marking your ballot. So in Georgia, they have these voting booths that are appropriate for a seated level, which makes sure that you can still vote on your own and in secret. Having assistive devices and inclusive poll worker training is also important. The image on the right-hand side is from Liberia, and it shows several men reading tactile ballot guides. So tactile ballot guides are a way for people who are blind to vote on their own and in secret. So it's like a folder, and you can put the ballot inside of the folder, and the folder has Braille or tactile on the top, and then you can mark your ballot and take it out of the folder and cast it, and it looks just like everybody else's ballot. The image on the left-hand side is from Guatemala, and it shows sign language of the Guatemalan Sign Language alphabet, as well as hello, goodbye, and thank you in Guatemalan Sign Language. So all poll workers in Guatemala learn this basic sign language as part of their poll worker training. So imagine if you are deaf and you come to the polling station and your poll worker knows how to greet you in your domestic sign language, how much more a welcome you might feel at the polling station. Something else I think is really important to highlight is youth leadership. So we want to make sure that we are sort of nipping in the bud one of the first barriers I mentioned, which is stigma. And a lot of that stigma might develop when you're a young person, and then it just sort of stays with you your whole life. So on the left-hand side is an image from Kenya, which shows a voter education for schools project poster. That's a cartoon, where there are images of young people with and without disabilities out in a schoolyard together. And having disability rights education when you're still in primary school is one way to help mitigate some of those stigma and some of those barriers that develop early on, and hopefully then develop a more inclusive society going forwards. The image on the right-hand side is from Kyrgyzstan, and it shows a young woman who has a face mask on, and she's holding up a sign that says #stay-at-home. And so in Kyrgyzstan, there have been very active movements of young people on Instagram, and they've been having Instagram live sessions where they're encouraging each other to maintain social distancing, encouraging each other, you know, sometimes it's a little sad to be at home for so long. I think we're all feeling this way. And these Instagram live sessions have been a way for young people to come together and feel like they're still having a sense of community, even though we're all at home. And then one of the last things I just wanted to highlight is something I've talked a little bit about throughout, but the importance of being an ally. So people with disabilities, as we said, are about 15% of the population. But it's really important for us as people with disabilities to have allies, both throughout government, throughout media, and throughout other civil society organizations, as well as to be allies to other people that are advocating for their rights. So this photo on the right-hand side is from Ukraine, and it shows a group of young women with disabilities who are participating in the International Women's Day March, which was this past March 8th in Kiev, in the capital. So these women with disabilities came and are participating in this broader women's movement to show their allyship and their support. The image on the left-hand side is from Libya, and it shows a man and a woman, and they're journalists. And so in Libya, there's been a lot of work being done with the disability rights community and the media to sort of build partnerships and awareness of disability rights, rights-based language, so that the media can be an ally for people with disabilities. So lastly, I'll just sort of summarize some of these good practice examples that I've discussed. I think one is focusing, like the ADA does, on implementation and enforcement specifically. So it's really important for us to have good laws on paper, but we want to make sure that those are being implemented and enforced. Next, it's important that we are actively engaging with people with all different types of disabilities. So not just people with physical disabilities, for example. Many DPOs, disabled persons organizations, are completely comprised of people with like one specific type of disability. So we want to make sure that when we talk about disability rights, we're talking about people with all different types of disabilities. And then the other thing that's important is thinking about how people with disabilities can be included not just in voting, but as a poll worker or as a candidate or a member of a political party. So all of the different ways that you could participate in political life. And then lastly, highlighting the importance of being a good ally and of collaborating with other people that are advocating for their rights in a peaceful way. So for example, women's organizations or universities or the media. And this slide does have a photo on it, and it shows a poll worker in the US for the last presidential elections that we had. And he's using a wheelchair, and he's surrounded by a group of Indonesian people, one of whom is taking his photo, and they were interviewing him. So these were Indonesian election observers that came to the US, and they were just very surprised that there was a poll worker who used a wheelchair. They just thought that was amazing, that they had not seen, someone with a disability in this type of leadership position before. So they were interviewing him and asking him lots of questions, taking his photo, and went back to Indonesia, I think, with a lot of ideas of how they could make sure that not only was voting accessible, but serving in these type of leadership positions like being a poll worker was accessible. So I will end it there. I think Nazmus, my colleague, has a few remarks also about what's happening specifically in Bangladesh.
Thank you, Virginia. We'll come back. We have many questions for you, Virginia. But first, I'm pleased to introduce Nazmus Sakib, a SAVE volunteer with IFES. SAVE means Students Against Violence Everywhere. Nazmus is a student at Dhaka University and a surprise to me, an old friend of the American Center. Nazmus was a performer on Music Buzz through the American Center last month in June in honor of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Shortly, I'll find the link and share it in our chat box. But Nazmus, we're so excited to have you with us to tell us about your experience in civic organizing and electoral processes. Nazmus, please.
Thank you. It's a little bit challenging for me as a visually impaired person to fix the video and audio, you understand. So firstly, thank you so very much, Josh, for your humble and generous introduction. And I'm very delighted to be the part of this session, especially Miss Virginia did a very fantastic job. He holistically presents the inclusive election and what is the it's look like. And I am very much like the stories and the disabled people struggle, disability rights activist success stories. It inspired me a lot. And the movies you mentioned, it's new to me. So I must check those movies as soon as I can. So as a person with disabilities and as a citizen of the, Bangladesh, 10 to 15% of Bangladeshi population are person with disabilities. There are significant number of people are youth with disabilities. So I'm representing the youth's view on the panel right now. So already Virginia mentioned Bangladesh is the signatory country of Human Rights Declaration and UNCRPD, and we are in constitutionally equally qualified citizen with others. But in our practices, the law and the reality goes in different path, And I can share a story. Few years ago, one of my visually impaired friend went to boat, to pass his boat, but to assist him, he took a family member, but but the controller office of the election center denies access of her assistant. So he went there, and they gave us a paper. He don't understand the paper, and this is the reality of the most visually impaired person. So so time is very short, so I shortly mention some challenges, then I will come back some recommendation that all youth leader can aspire to change those things. So firstly, our authorities, election commission, political parties, and other stakeholders, even civil society as well, they have no orientation about disability. They think, Virginia already mentioned, every disabled people have unique challenges. They think the physical barriers only the barriers, the invisible disability, they have no concept about that. So disability issue is very diverse issue, but our political parties and election commissions have no ideas about the diverse needs of person with disabilities, and they are not aware of our law as well. So this is another big factor. So second issue, the stigma. As a person with disability, we face lots of stigma, misinformation, disinformation. Even in COVID-19 situation, we face sometimes the doctor are not treating the corona disabled patient who are Down syndrome disability. They are face challenges. So our society have lots of misinformation about us. We are the bad actors. If we casting any vote, it will harm the candidate. So lots of misinformation is there, and the families of person with disabilities sometimes ignore the fact that we have the same capacity, same rights to go to the vote, and this is the stigma, I can say, the big issue in Bangladesh. Third issue is accessibility. Accessibility. It's very interesting because the story you can relate that our papers, our election notice, and disabled person. Suppose I studied in Dhaka University. There are lots of students who are educationally go forward, but they are aspire to be a parliamentarian or but our political parties and all the election stakeholder believe that we have the simple requirement, we have to do our votes, it's enough. So another thing is that, so accessible voting center is absence, and sometimes there is no ramp or a lift for physical disabled people or sign language interpretation. That's the reality here. So finally, we, as a person with disability, we are the equal citizen of this nation. So in the election process, the election determined our life. It impacted our life. If we cannot actively participate in the election process, how the process are more disabled inclusive, how the system, the systematic discrimination will end. So as a youth leader, I aspire to be the change. We need to raise our voices every sphere of our society where disabled people faces any discrimination. If we work together, there is a way. So I also request EMK Center and the good organization of American Embassy Dhaka to host and to make curriculum for all the disabled people out there. Some good practices in our country, the civil society and the organization, non-profit organization make a good example, then we will use it on the other, we can show them that this is the model of disability inclusion. So we want to be an active citizen of this nation. EMK Center or American Center are also promoting the leadership or active citizenship. We want to participate those events as a part of all the person with disabilities. And finally, nothing about us without us. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much. Those were excellent comments. We're very happy to have young people in Bangladesh engaged in the electoral process and folks advocating for rights in and among their peers and in the community. Thank you for your work. We have many questions that have come in. Virginia, I'll package a couple questions together for you. First, a few questions related to the United States. Why has the United States not ratified the UN document on disabilities? And
That's a very good question. Oh, yep.
in the
More?
US, how is statistical data related to disabilities generated or collected? And finally, two additional questions. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, what special enforcement mechanisms exist and have they been effective? Finally, does the Americans with Disabilities Act say anything about equal treatment of women and girls?
Okay, those are all good questions. The first one about why we haven't ratified the CRPD, this is a very good question, and it's quite upsetting. So for those of you that don't know the history, the US signed the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and the way that our structure works for international treaties in the US is that the president can sign a treaty, but he can't ratify it. I say he, hopefully one day we can also say she, he or she. So President Obama signed the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And then the way that ratification works is that it has to go through our Senate. So it then went to the Senate for ratification and it didn't pass. And at the time there was many reasons given. The main overarching reason is that there's a lot of sort of anti-internationalism sentiment in Congress here in the US. And so I think many people in the US that are in Congress thought, well, we have the ADA is, you know, the gold star. Why do we need to also sign on to this UN mechanism? But there are several things under the CRPD that are actually stronger protections for people with disabilities than the ADA. And in my opinion, the CRPD also, you know, has this international element that's important for us to recognize. So the ADA is helpful, obviously, domestically, but it doesn't have any commitments, it doesn't make any commitments on behalf of the US government to be disability inclusive, for example, in our foreign policy or in our international development work, or to collaborate and share good practices and lessons learned, internationally. The ADA has actually quite detailed guidance, and we have what are called ADA centers in states all across the US that help share good practice across US states. But I personally would like to see us also doing that internationally and having an international version of that. So the CRPD, like I said, came up for a vote once on the Senate side, and it didn't pass. And then a few years later, a group of disability activists really pushed and pushed and brought it back again for a vote, and it didn't pass again. So this is quite disappointing for those of us here in the US that work on international disability rights, and something that we hope maybe in the near future could hopefully be passed. We are involved in the Conference of States Parties to the CRPD. So because we've signed the treaty, we can go to the UN Conference of States Parties, which is every year in June. And unfortunately didn't happen this past year because of the coronavirus. But usually the US government would be sending a delegation to that. But we are not able to participate in the CRPD committee, like the government of Bangladesh, for example, is. You can only do that once you've ratified. So I hope we will ratify at some point in the near future, and then that way we can also participate, more effectively in these international mechanisms on disability rights. The other questions, I guess, were about data collection on disability and enforcement mechanisms. So in some countries, data on disability is actually collected by the Election Commission. So when people register to vote, you would also then collect information on disability. That doesn't happen here in the US. It's mainly by the National Census. But in terms of implementation and enforcement, it's again on functioning rather than on collection of how many people with disabilities there are. So the Center for Disease Control here in the US estimates actually that 1 in 4 Americans has a disability. So 1 in 4 would be like 25%, which is higher than the World Health Organization's estimate of 15% globally. And Canada has similar numbers in the 22% range. The UK has similar numbers. And some of the reasons that are given for this are that in the US, the UK, Canada, there are disability benefits that you might get. So there's not as much stigma of self-identifying as having a disability, because you might actually also get some sort of financial compensation or enumeration if you have difficulty working. And then similarly, there might be slightly less stigma with self-identifying with having an intellectual or a psychosocial disability. So if you think about in the US, if it's 1 in 4 Americans has a disability, that's 25%. Think about in countries that have, a lot of conflict or have maybe poorer healthcare systems, the number is probably actually higher than that 15% estimate. But to go back to the implementation and enforcement question, it is actually quite effective, the enforcement mechanisms of the ADA. It is one thing that works as suggested, as it's supposed to. So for example, the Department of Justice has a specific section, the Civil Rights section, which will go out on election day and monitor compliance of polling stations for accessibility. So the Department of Justice, the federal government, sends lawyers out to the state level to look at compliance of polling station accessibility. And if they're not accessible, the federal government has sued, in many cases, state authorities. And so those enforcement mechanisms are actually quite effective in terms of voting rights for people with disabilities. In terms of the ADA mentioning something specific for women and girls, there's not any like unique, there's not like separate rights or things that are enumerated, but the ADA is inclusive of all people. I think those were all the questions. Josh, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes. Yes, so does the ADA specifically deal with gender, women, and girls? Is the Americans with Disabilities Act applicable only to Americans, or does it relate to people of other national origin in the United States or outside of the United States. And in the United States, are persons with psychosocial disabilities permitted to vote?
So people with psychosocial disabilities are not excluded explicitly. There's nothing that says specifically people with psychosocial disabilities cannot vote. However, as I mentioned before, many states, majority of states, have these regulations that say if you're under guardianship, then you're not allowed to vote. And often people with psychosocial disabilities are under guardianship. The US, quite a few different states in the US also have election laws that read very similarly to the language in the Constitution in Bangladesh about people of unsound mind not being able to vote, that exact phrase, unsound mind. And so sometimes also that phrase is applied to people with psychosocial disabilities. So there's still, I think this is the biggest area that we need to work on here in the US is enhancing voting rights for people with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities. And part of this is work that needs to be done on legal reform. Part of it is work that needs to be done on sensitization of family members. You know, so sometimes family members of people with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities don't see the reason why they would want to participate in political life and are not supportive. So we need to do more work there in terms of eliminating that stigma. And then once we get past those two things, the legal barriers and the stigma barriers, there needs to be more voter education information. You know, so more information and easy to read, for example, that I was just referencing. So this, to me, is the main, this is like the biggest frontier left for voting and access for people with disabilities in the US is people with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities.
So Virginia, due to COVID-19, many countries in the world have suspended elections or implemented special restrictions on movement. However, few elections has any country taken special steps to accommodate and encourage persons with disabilities to vote during the pandemic? And if so, what methods can make voting more accessible for persons with disabilities during pandemic?
It's a very good question. Oh.
Second, some countries of the world require special national ID cards or other provisions to be included for a person to be included on a voter list or participation list for elections. Enforcement varies. Does this dissuade or disadvantage persons with disabilities from full participation?
So I'll answer that one first, actually. This is a huge issue. For example, I was in Myanmar several years ago and was talking to a group of young people with disabilities. And none of them had voted before, but were really interested in doing it. And then as we were talking, we realized that none of them had the national identification that was required in order to register to vote. And the reason they didn't have it is because they have a disability. And when they were born, you know, the government, their parents, et cetera, everyone just thought, well, this national identification card is used to, you know, get married, it's used to get a job. And it was just kind of assumed that because, you know, these young people were born with a disability, they wouldn't need to do any of those things. So why bother with the paperwork of getting this ID card? Which is just really pretty ridiculous. So now we have these people that are voting age and they don't have the necessary documentation, all because of false assumptions, you know, about what their interest would be in participating in normal, you know, things that everyone else, all their fellow citizens were doing. So this is a really big problem actually for people with disabilities specifically, is having that initial ID card that's required in most countries to vote. For your second question, or I guess your first question about COVID and voting, in the US actually, quite a few states already allowed people with disabilities only to vote remotely. And these remote voting options have been expanded, both postal voting and in some cases voting on apps, so mobile applications, has now been expanded so that everyone can use these alternative measures during COVID. So in some ways, the disability community kind of paved the way and made it so that we are slightly more prepared to have accessible methods of voting during COVID. Australia, for example, has also done something similar. In Australia, voting is actually mandatory. So you don't get to choose if you want to vote or not. It's required. And if you don't vote, then you have to pay a fine that they take just right out of your paycheck. So because it's compulsory to vote in Australia, they really proactively seek, access measures there so that everyone can vote. And so they are actually, they have a vote by telephone system in Australia. And that is now also being expanded because of COVID-19 to allow more voters to have access to that in this current context. There's been some movement in different US states to look at online voting. And that is just, it doesn't seem like we're really quite there yet in terms of finding a way that we could vote online in secret. But many people, many Americans with disabilities are really pushing for voting online, because then you can use your own assistive device at home rather than having to try and figure out, whatever system there is at the polling station. And it's also helpful because currently most US states, the vote from home option is voting by mail. And voting by mail is not accessible to people who are blind or people who have low vision. So you would still need someone, to mark your ballot for you. You would have to tell somebody your vote. You'd have to hope they vote the way that you asked, and that they don't tell anyone else if you're not comfortable having anyone else know how you voted. And so that's not really an accessible option. So there's, I think, a lot more work being done to find a safe way to vote online, but we're not there yet. I think that's sort of maybe the next frontier of voting.
So, friends and colleagues, we have a few minutes left, about 5 minutes, and then we're going to start wrapping up. So if you have final questions, please submit them in the chat box. We'll do our best to get to them. So Virginia, it sounds like in the US context, maybe, COVID-19 and the push in the US context to accommodate alternatives to in-person voting in the long term may be helpful to persons with disabilities. Does that seem like an appropriate thought?
The push for alternative voting measures, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think the push for alternative voting measures will benefit people with disabilities in the long run. And also some of the steps the disability community has already advocated for advanced voting measures are now helping everybody, because we're better placed when COVID-19 happened. Many states already have some alternative voting measures in place. And those, in many cases, the reason those are in place are because of advocacy from the disability community.
And Virginia, have you observed election commissions anywhere in the world which include persons with disabilities?
Yes, yeah. For example, the Philippines has a commissioner that's specifically responsible for disability inclusion. And that person is not always someone with a disability, but it has been someone with a disability in the past. There are quite a few election commissions around the world now that are starting to have disability inclusion focal points. And sometimes those people are people with disabilities, sometimes not. Sometimes people with disabilities are in other roles in the election commission that have nothing to do with disability, which is also great. So yes, this is not unheard of.
Earlier in your program, you mentioned 2 specific movie films. Could you restate those film titles?
Lives Worth Living, and that was originally aired on PBS, just for your knowledge, Josh. And then Crip Camp. And Crip Camp just came out this year, and it's on Netflix.
Thank you. Do you have a statistic about the percentage of people with disabilities who cast their vote in the United States, globally, or any country in particular? A percentage of the population.
So this is hard to capture because it requires sort of either a voter register that has people with disabilities marked in the voter register, or it requires sort of after the fact exit polling, which relies on people self-identifying. So it's kind of notoriously inaccurate, but there are trends that we see in different countries, which for the most part show that people with disabilities do not turn out at the same rate as people without disabilities. And I think many of the things we discussed are the reasons why that might be. You know, lack of information, knowing that maybe when you come to the polling station, people, you know, you might encounter some stigma. Maybe the polling station's not going to be physically accessible. So a lot of the advocacy that we do with the disability rights community is supporting awareness raising with political parties, because if you're thinking of 15% of the population, in some cases more, that's not being targeted, that's a lot of voters that if you were to just have a sign language interpreter or put your information in an accessible format, you could really expand your reach. So there's a lot more work I think that needs to be done there.
I have two additional questions. The first, specifically in Bangladesh, how do you think we can increase citizen participation in voting? In recent years, citizen participation has been decreasing.
So I think actually Nazmus is a good one to answer that question. I would just say internationally, sort of the main lessons learned for increasing citizen participation is awareness raising. And in this case, making sure that people with disabilities have, you know, a reason to vote. Like just because the process is accessible and inclusive, you still need to be convinced on why you should participate. But maybe Nazmus has some ideas specifically in Bangladesh, what you would recommend. I think your video just turned off, Nazmus.
While we try to bring Nazmus back, Virginia, are you able to, as a parting thought before we move on, are you able to outline the 5 titles, the 5 primary aspects of the Americans with Disabilities Act?
Sure, I can pop those in the chat here. So the first one is focused on employment, Title 1. Title 2 is focused on sort of government organizations and buildings and public transportation. Title 3 is on reasonable accommodations that we were discussing before, as well as businesses and commercial enterprises. And Title 4 is on communications. So that's on, like, for example, government websites are supposed to be accessible, sign language interpreters are supposed to be provided at coronavirus briefings, these sort of things. And then Title 5 is where there's like a catch-all of everything else. But let me see if I can find the ADA website. I'm sure has them all detailed, and I can pop that in the chat.
That would be wonderful.
Something else that I haven't discussed is there's something called the Job Accommodation Network, JAN. And it's a service that's provided free of charge to companies that you can ask questions about. If you want to hire somebody with a disability, you can reach out to the Job Accommodation Network and say like, hey, we want to hire someone with a disability, you know, this is what their disability is, how can we make sure that our workplace is accessible? And so that's a really helpful resource for everyone to make sure that employment is more accessible and inclusive.
Well, thank you. If we're not able to pull that up, we can reach out to some of our guests.
Yep, I just found it. I'm popping it in the chat now. So this is Title I, and at the bottom of that page, there's links to the others. Nazmus, looks like you're unmuted.
Am I audible now?
Yes, we hear you, Nazmus.
So, Josh, can you give me the questions again?
The question, Nazmus, was what do you think could be done to increase voter participation in Bangladesh?
So, I want to answer it in my perspective as a person with disability, how we increase the person with disability voters in the elections. So, there holistically, Miss Virginia mentioned lots of reasonable accommodation, accessible voting system, all those things. If all those things taken care of, then person with disability may be more interested to vote. Another thing is that the violence, sometimes there in our country, there is a possibility or tension, maybe violence occurred. The sense of the security or violence, it's the another thing our government and all the parties need to think about the election center more secure for person with disability. If those things need taking properly addressed, I think person with disability can go to the election and cast their votes.
Nazmus, did you finish?
Yes.
Or did we lose your audio?
No, I finished my part.
Well, thank you. So friends, we are reaching the end of our time today. Before we close, we have a few friends who would like to make a few comments. First, it's my great pleasure to introduce a member of parliament here in Bangladesh, Mr. Saber Chowdhury, a man who has worked tirelessly on many important activities, not the least of which include environment, and we have been happy to cooperate together on several programs. Mr. Chowdhury.
Yes, I can hear you, Josh. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh, for the invitation. And Virginia, thank you for an excellent presentation. You know, we could spend hours literally on all of the major issues that you highlighted. But I think just for context, of course, we have the upcoming US elections. There is the 30 years of the American Disabilities Act. And the other aspect, of course, is the Sustainable Development Goals, which has the very aspirational statement of leaving no one behind. So when we were trying to assess in Bangladesh, what are the segments of our society who are in danger of being left behind? Of course, those with disability featured prominently. So I think that is also a very strong compulsion for us to take action on it. In terms of what we can do practically in Bangladesh, which is what I was thinking of. And Virginia, you talked about the gender dimension, that women are disproportionately afflicted by disabilities. So, and we also talked at length about how we can get voter participation. I was looking at it slightly differently, in addition to what has been discussed. How can we get MPs who have disabilities? How can we get in the parliament public representatives who can speak? Now, I engaged with the Thai parliament when I was president of the IPU, when they were devising their constitution. And they talked about quotas for people with disabilities. I think a constitutional amendment is going to be too big of an ask. But what we could perhaps do is, we have this quota of women parliamentarians. Can we encourage the political parties to consider when they are nominating women, whether it can be someone with a disability? And that then leads on to the other issue of social stigma and changing attitudes. Maybe this could be an issue where in a country such as Bangladesh, where sometimes politics tends to be very polarized, where we can have cross-party consensus on an agenda for making inclusion an important part of our election manifesto. I think that's going to be quite useful. And Nazmus also mentioned about the electoral violence. So I think if the political parties start owning this agenda, I think that's also going to address the issue of inclusion. And of course, in terms of changing habits and how we look upon the individuals. And I think the way to do it is not that they are marginalized or they are a burden, but they are an asset to a growing economy such as Bangladesh. I mean, human resources is one of our most important assets. So how can we be more inclusive in terms of laying a foundation for our growth, which is much more broader in terms of base and actually captures anyone? The other area where I think we can work with the American Center would be on the statistics. The question that Josh actually put was something that I had requested him to ask you, Virginia. And in Bangladesh, generally, we assume that it's 10% of the population. But when I looked at how the Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics functions, which is actually the agency which is responsible for this, they don't have a standalone survey. So one of the priorities would be, how can we get a standalone survey just on disability? At the moment, what they're doing is they're basically mixing and matching. They have household surveys, they have other employment surveys. But I think we should really, to understand the scale of the problem and what needs to be done, there should be a standalone survey. And you have already shared, Virginia, the areas where we can look at the issue of how do we address disability? How do we do what needs to be done? I think that's always terribly important. We can list, the government should take action, this has to be done, but how do we actually go about doing it? And you mentioned something, there was a reference in your presentation to the federal government actually advising the state governments on how to go about things. And if there is a complaint, there's an oversight body on the states, whether they are following through on the various declarations that have been made. So I think it's, I've certainly learned a lot, and usually I turn up in these events not to speak, but to really understand more of the situation. I think it's important that MPs are also sensitized across the board. I think that's where the change can really happen, not just in terms of articulation of policy, but also in terms of allocation of resources through the budgetary process. But for that, we really need to understand the scale of the problem. We need to have a better insight and grip on what are the forms of disabilities. And once we have done that, we will be able to project an accurate picture of what the needs are. And once the needs are established, they are clearly defined. And I think for that, people such as Nazmus and the others, it's wonderful that they are organizing themselves. I think those voices have to be heard, and we have to provide a platform for them to present those voices. So I hope this is going to be an issue which we are going to be much more engaged in the Parliament of Bangladesh. There's a lot of focus, and rightly so, in terms of, the daughter of the Prime Minister has been very involved in certain areas on special needs of children in particular. So I think this is an agenda that we can certainly promote. And thank you for the invitation. I look forward to engaging on this very important subject matter in the future. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor and privilege for us to be able to welcome you, and thank you so much for your for your words. I think there is a lot of work for all of us to do everywhere in the world. Before we sign off for the evening, Virginia, do you have any final thoughts before we begin to tune off today?
Well, one thing actually just inspired by the previous remarks, there is something called the Washington City Group questions. And these questions are, they're standardized questions related to disability that are also based on functioning. So for example, do you have difficulty climbing stairs? Do you have difficulty seeing without glasses? I will pop this link into the chat, and that might be something that you might want to discuss in Bangladesh, of using these questions to capture disability. And they're being used more and more internationally now to have sort of comparable data across countries on disability rights as well, because unfortunately, you know, either countries are not collecting data on how many people with disabilities are citizens, or they're collecting conflicting information, so we can't compare apples to apples, this information. So the Australian government in particular has been leading on using these standardized Washington Group questions. And so I just dropped those in the box, and those might be helpful as you have further discussions on that topic.
Well, thank you very much, Virginia. What I can tell you all here tonight, friends, is that creating a world which rejects racism and combats conscious and unconscious bias, which recognizes universal human rights and works toward full inclusion and participation of all societies, is a goal with which all of us should work. In the United States, much work remains to be done to create such a place. Tonight, I'm happy that Virginia and Nazmus Sakib, and throughout the course of this program, more than 150 friends joined us online for this conversation about inclusion in electoral processes. It tells us that this is an important topic, that the collective we are interested in participating fully and exercising democracy. As the United States prepares for a national election, citizens across the United States will be turning out to raise their voices at the ballot box to express their will and shape our government. Tonight, I'm so grateful that you have been here. Thank you for your time with us today. We're very thankful to Arif, our talented interpreter, and to all of you. Please reach out to the embassy. Tell us what's going on. If there's a way that we can be supportive or develop collaborative programming on these kinds of topics, we are certainly willing to discuss ways to collaborate. I'm so happy you've been with us today. Thank you very much. Good night.